The ice didn't just crack, it screamed. Sloane plunged her numb hands into the sub-zero water. The frantic current pulled at her thick wool coat, threatening to drag her under the black, churning surface. She braced her boots against the jagged edge of the ice floe and pulled with everything she had. A sodden weight crested the surface, wet fur, limp limbs. She hauled the first wolf onto the snowy river bank. It was dead weight, far too heavy for her frame. Her lungs burned with the effort. The winter cold was physical, pressing into her chest and stealing the fragile air right out of her throat. She shouldn't be doing this. Every survival instinct she possessed told her to turn around, walk back into the tree line, and vanish into the isolation that had kept her alive for a decade. A lone shifter exposing herself in the open was a fatal risk. The ruling council strictly forbade unsanctioned existence. The penalty was permanent imprisonment. But her buried pack instinct, the raw biological imperative she tried so hard to crush, screamed louder than the breaking ice. The frozen shelf beneath her right boot gave way. She slipped, crying out as icy water flooded over her knees. Scrambling backward, she dug her cracked nails into the frozen earth of the bank. She reached down again, ignoring the agonizing numbness in her fingers, and dragged a second wolf up beside the first. Then a third. The sheer magnitude of the disaster settled over her. The river was a graveyard of drowning giants. They were everywhere, trapped beneath the broken ice, sinking slowly into the dark. Sloane crawled closer to the edge, the wind whipping wet hair across her face. The aroma of ozone and freezing mud filled her nose. She reached her arms back into the freezing depths, her muscles screaming in protest. She grabbed another thick handful of wet fur. She planted her boots. She pulled. 4, she gasped, her voice ragged in the empty woods. She grabbed another fistful of coarse gray fur and hauled the beast onto the frost-covered rocks. Her arms shook. The white-hot flash of adrenaline was fading fast, replaced by an exhaustion that threatened to pull her to the ground. 5. The wind howled through the barren trees, carrying the bitter scent of pine. Sloane dropped to her knees. She couldn't feel her toes anymore. The cold was sinking directly into her bones, slowing her thoughts, making her clumsy. 6. She dragged the next one by the scruff of its neck. These weren't normal wolves. They had broad chests and paws the size of dinner plates. Shifters, a fully grown pack, incapacitated by the freezing depths of the river. Why was she doing this? Why risk her freedom for strangers who would likely turn her into the council the second they thawed? 7. Because they were dying. Because the sight of their limp bodies triggered a primal ache in her chest that she couldn't ignore. She crawled to the water's edge again. The rhythm of the brutal work became a twisted sort of meditation. Reach, grip, pull, breathe. 8. Her vision blurred at the edges. She wiped her face, leaving a streak of freezing mud across her cheek. 9. The wind bit right through her soaked clothes. She was going to freeze to death out here, dying right on the banks of the river, surrounded by a pack she didn't even belong to. 10. Her hands were numb. She was operating on pure willpower now. She gripped the matted fur of the next wolf, planted her feet, and threw her weight backward to dislodge it from the ice. 11. Sloane collapsed backward into the snow, staring up at the unforgiving sky. Her chest heaved. The icy air burned her throat like acid. 11 bodies lay scattered across the riverbank, their chests rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. She had done it. She could go home now, leave them to recover, and disappear back into the safety of her hidden life. Then, a low scrape echoed from the rocks below the ice shelf. Sloane rolled painfully onto her stomach and crawled back to the jagged edge. The 12th wolf made the others look like pups. His fur was pitch black, thick and heavily scarred across the broad muzzle. He wasn't just sinking, he was anchored. She slid down the snowy bank, plunging waist deep into the freezing water. The shock of the cold punched the breath from her lungs. She reached the giant wolf and gripped his thick coat. He was easily 600 pounds of dead weight. She pulled, screaming with the effort, the sound lost to the roaring winter storm. As his side crested the water, she saw it. A thick, jagged bolt protruded deep from his ribs. The skin around the wound was blackened, spider-webbed with unnatural dark veins. Silver. The sharp metallic tang of it hit her nose, sickening and distinct. Someone had hunted them. Someone had used council-grade silver poison. Her mind raced. If hunters were close enough to drop a pack this large, they were close enough to find her right now. She hauled the black wolf onto the shore, collapsing beside him. He wasn't breathing right. His chest stuttered. The silver was spreading rapidly, choking him from the inside. She couldn't leave him. The poison would reach his heart in less than an hour. Her body moved on instinct. She scrambled up the frozen bank and began tearing dead branches from the fallen pines. Her frozen fingers clumsily wove the wood together with vines and the leather strap of her satchel, engineering a crude sled in seconds. She rolled the Alpha onto the makeshift rig. The wood groaned under him. "Come on," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. "Don't die on me now." She grabbed the pulling straps, wrapped them tightly around her forearms, and leaned forward. The sled dragged against the snow, an agonizing crawl toward the deep woods. Every step was a battle against the elements. The blizzard was picking up fast, erasing her tracks, but also blinding her. She focused entirely on the faint outline of the mountains, navigating the treacherous trails that led to her sanctuary. She hauled him for what felt like hours. Her mind detached from the physical pain, focused solely on the rhythmic crunch of the snow beneath her boots. Finally, the dark outline of her hidden cabin emerged through the whiteout. She dragged the heavy sled up the wooden steps, kicked the door open, and hauled the bleeding beast inside. The cabin slammed shut against the blizzard, plunging them into the quiet, dry warmth. But as she looked down at the poison giant on her floor, she knew she hadn't just brought a wolf inside. She had brought the war directly to her doorstep. The heat of the hearth fire hit her frozen skin like a physical blow. Sloane ignored the trembling in her hands. She dragged the black wolf onto the oak table in the center of the cabin. His breathing was wet and shallow. The black veins spreading from the bolt in his ribs pulsed with a toxic rhythm. She had less than 5 minutes before the silver stopped his heart. She sprinted to the far wall and ripped open her canvas medical kit. Glass clattered. She grabbed a pair of iron tongs, a curved hunting knife, and a bottle of high-proof alcohol. She poured the alcohol directly over the iron knife. The fumes burned her nose, cutting through the scent of wet fur.
"Don't move," she whispered to the unconscious beast. She pressed her left hand firmly against his heavily muscled chest. His fur was scorching hot. His fever was spiking dangerously fast. With her right hand, she guided the tip of the curved knife into the torn flesh surrounding the wooden shaft. The wolf thrashed. A guttural snarl ripped through the small cabin. His jaws snapped just inches from her face, his teeth clicking together with bone-crushing force. Sloane didn't flinch. She leaned her entire body weight onto his chest, pinning him down with frantic desperation. "I said don't move." She dug the blade deeper. The metallic tang of fresh blood and the sharp scent of ozone filled the claustrophobic space. The silver poison was burning him from the inside out. She dropped the knife and grabbed the iron tongs, clamping the cold metal firmly around the slick, bloody base of the bolt. She planted her boots against the floorboards for leverage. She took a ragged breath. She ripped the bolt free. Dark, ruined blood cascaded over the edge of the wooden table. The wolf let out a high whine before going limp. Sloane scrambled for the cotton packing rolls. She shoved them hard into the open wound, pressing her palms flat against his ribs to stop the hemorrhage. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Slowly, the heavy rise and fall of his chest steadied. The erratic stuttering of his heart leveled out into a deep, rhythmic thumping beneath her bloody hands. He was breathing. Sloane collapsed back against the floorboards, her chest heaving. The bloody silver bolt lay discarded near the fireplace, hissing faintly as the toxic residue burned against the stone. She closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion finally pull her down. Then, a low, collective growl shook the floorboards directly beneath her boots. Sloane's eyes snapped open. The front door of the cabin shuddered. A second guttural snarl echoed from the porch, followed by the rhythmic thud of massive paws pacing across the wooden planks. They had followed her. The 11 wolves from the river. Her body moved on instinct. She rolled across the floor, grabbing the loaded crossbow resting beside the hearth. She scrambled into the dark corner of the room, raising the weapon, her bloody finger resting lightly on the trigger. The front door didn't just open, it splintered inward. The frozen wood shattered off the iron hinges. The winter wind howled into the warm room. One by one, the wolves pushed their way into the cramped cabin. The space was instantly suffocating. The heat radiating off their bodies pushed the cold out, replacing it with the heavy, musky scent of apex predators. Sloane kept the crossbow steady. Then, the visceral, wet sound of shifting began. It was a terrible noise, bones snapping and reforming, muscle tearing and weaving together. Sloane forced herself not to look away. She had never seen a pack shift together. She had never been this close to death. When the shadows finally settled, 11 towering, lethal men stood in her destroyed doorway. Broad-shouldered warriors covered in tribal ink and fresh scratches from the ice. The vanguard. Elite council enforcers. The very men tasked with hunting down rogues exactly like her. Sloane held her breath. This was her execution. The man at the front, a giant with a brutal scar across his jaw, stepped forward. His gaze swept the small room. He looked at the shattered door. He looked at the bloody silver bolt hissing by the fire. He looked at Sloane, cornered in the dark, her hands stained crimson. Finally, he looked at the black wolf breathing steadily on the oak table. The tension broke. The scarred warrior turned his gaze back to Sloane. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't lunge. Instead, He slowly lowered his frame to the blood-stained floorboards and dropped to one knee. Behind him, the 10 other killers moved in perfect unison. They dropped to their knees, bowing their heads to the small, feral woman shivering in the corner. Reverence. Sloane lowered the crossbow slightly, her mind short-circuiting. The fierce, untouchable vanguard was kneeling in her living room. As the silence stretched, a heavy groan erupted from the oak table. The 12th wolf was waking up.
The sound of his shifting was different. It wasn't a violent snapping of bone. It was a slow expansion of raw power. The air in the cabin grew heavier, pressing down on Sloane's lungs. She watched from the corner, paralyzed as the black beast dissolved into the shape of a man. He was colossal. Even lying severely injured on the wooden table, his sheer size was overwhelming. Thick scars crossed his broad chest, aligning perfectly with the marks she had seen on the wolf. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat and river water. Sloane stared at his face, the sharp, aristocratic jawline, the rigid, unforgiving brow. Panic seized her throat, cold and absolute. She knew that face. Every hidden shifter in the realm knew that face. It was stamped on the silver coins she used to buy black market supplies. It was plastered on the brutal council edicts nailed to the tavern walls. Roman, the Alpha King. The architect of the very laws she had spent her entire life running from. The tyrant who ordered the permanent imprisonment of anyone living outside the sanctioned pacts. She had just saved her own executioner. Sloane dropped the crossbow and snatched the bloody surgical scalpel from the floor. She backed up until her spine hit the rough wooden wall of the cabin. The 11 vanguard warriors remained perfectly still, kneeling on the floorboards, their heads bowed. They wouldn't dare move while their king was waking. Roman let out a harsh, ragged breath. The muscles in his arms corded as he gripped the edges of the oak table. Slowly, agonizingly, he pushed himself up into a sitting position. He didn't look at the kneeling warriors. He didn't look at his own blood pooling on the wood. His head snapped directly toward the dark corner of the room. His eyes opened. They were a piercing, inhuman gold, burning through the dim light of the cabin. They locked onto Sloane with predatory calculation. He took in her soaked clothes, her trembling hands, and the tiny, pathetic scalpel she held pointed at his chest. He saw everything. He understood exactly what she was. Sloane tightened her grip on the blade, ready to fight for a life she was about to lose. Roman stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Then, his ruined voice rumbled through the small space, hitting her chest like physical force. "Stand down." The command hung heavily in the cramped, musky air of the cabin. Sloane did not drop the scalpel. Her knuckles remained stark white around the small metal handle, her pulse thudding against her eardrums. She pressed her spine harder against the rough wooden wall. Roman shifted his weight on the ruined oak table. The movement clearly pulled at his freshly packed wound, but his golden eyes never left hers. He didn't look like a man who had just bled out on a kitchen floor. He looked like a predator assessing a stubborn, cornered problem. "You are unsanctioned." His voice was a grating rumble that rattled the glass in the frosted window panes.
It wasn't a question. It was a clinical observation. I am alive, and you are bleeding in my house. The 11 vanguard warriors tensed instantly on the floorboards. A low, collective rumble vibrated through the room, a warning growl directed at the feral woman daring to speak to the king with disrespect. Roman raised a single hand. The growling ceased. "You saved my pack," Roman stated slowly. His gaze flicked to the shattered wooden door, the howling blizzard pouring into the room, and finally locked back onto her pale face. "You belie these woods. You know how to survive the whiteout." Sloane stared at him, her mind racing desperately. The audacity of the Alpha King. He wasn't arresting her, he was conscripting her. "You want me to guide you." Her grip on the scalpel finally loosened a fraction. "I require it." "No." The vanguard shifted uneasily. The tension in the room spiked to a dangerous level. No one said no to the king. Roman's expression didn't harden into anger. Instead, a flicker of fiery intrigue sparked in his golden eyes. He watched her with genuine fascination. "You would rather freeze in here when the mercenaries arrive?" "I will guide you out of the valley," Sloane countered, her voice dropping into a cold, transactional rhythm. "But my debt is paid the moment we cross the tree line into the lowlands. I walk away. Full amnesty. You never saw me, and your hounds never track me." Roman stared at the feral, blood-soaked woman, demanding terms from the authority of the realm. A long pause stretched between them, thick with unvoiced threats and shifting power dynamics. "Agreed." He pushed himself off the table, his boots hitting the floorboards with a dull thud. He towered over her, casting a shadow across the bloodied room. "Lead the way." Sloane realized she had just chained herself to a monster to escape the executioner. She grabbed her wool coat. They stepped out into the blinding white of the winter forest. The cold was a living, malicious entity that tried to crush them from all sides. Sloane took the lead without hesitation. She moved through the waist-deep snowdrifts with a gliding rhythm she had perfected over a decade of brutal isolation. She read the subtle ripples in the snowpack, effortlessly avoiding hidden ice crevasses and hollow streams without breaking her stride. Behind her, the progression of the vanguard was agonizingly slow and loud. They were far too heavy. The warriors sunk deeply into the powder, their thick boots crunching violently against the icy crust. Roman walked directly behind Sloane. She could hear his ragged breathing over the howling wind. The silver wound was taking a toll on his system, forcing his body to work twice as hard to regulate his internal temperature. "Keep to the high ridge," Sloane called back over her shoulder, not stopping to see if they obeyed. "The ice shelf below the dead pines is hollow. You will drop right through." Roman didn't argue. He signaled the vanguard with a flick of his wrist. They adjusted their frames instantly, following in her exact footprints. Sloane risked a quick glance backward. Roman was watching her. His golden eyes tracked her fluid movements, silently analyzing how she navigated the deadly terrain that his elite killers struggled to conquer. His structured worldview, the belief that all rogues were undisciplined liabilities, was fracturing in real time. She was undeniably outperforming them in her element. She felt a spike of fierce pride. She wasn't just surviving the wild anymore, she was leading the king through it. The wind shifted abruptly, carrying the bitter scent of wet stone and metallic decay. Her body moved on instinct. She threw her right arm out, halting instantly in her tracks. "Stop." The vanguard froze. Roman stepped up close behind her, his chest brushing against the back of her heavy coat. The raw heat radiating off his body was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the biting winter cold. "What is it?" His voice was a low rumble right next to her ear. Sloane knelt slowly in the deep powder. She brushed away the top layer of fresh snow with clinical caution. Buried out of sight beneath a cluster of dead pine needles, a metallic glint caught the dim gray light. A snare. She traced the razor-sharp wire back to a heavy iron anchor bolted to a hidden tree stump beneath the ice. The wire was coated in a dark, shimmering paste. "Silver-laced," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up at the barren trees surrounding the ridge. "It's a fresh trap, laid within the hour." Roman stared heavily at the deadly wire, his jaw clenching tight. The implication was immediate and terrifying for the crippled pack. "Then didn't lose our trail," Roman rumbled, scanning the jagged ridges above them with predatory focus. "They are actively trying to herd us." Sloane stood up slowly, her muscles coiling tight. The hunters weren't just close. They were steering them directly into an ambush. They made a crude, concealed camp in the hollowed-out base of a dead redwood. There was no fire. A fire would act as a beacon for the hunters tracking them. They huddled together in the freezing dark, the vanguard forming a silent perimeter in the snow, while Roman and Sloane sat near the back of the hollowed wood. The unspoken tension in the cramped space was suffocating. Sloane ripped a piece of dried meat with her teeth, glaring relentlessly at the man sitting across from her. He looked physically exhausted, his broad shoulders slumped slightly against the bark, but his golden eyes were still tracking her every move with intense focus. "You marched right into their bottleneck," Sloane broke the silence, her voice a sharp whisper in the dark. "If I hadn't seen the snare, your elite pack would be bleeding out in the snow right now." "My pack," Roman rumbled back, his tone dropping low, "was ambushed by cowards using poison because they are terrified to face us directly. It has nothing to do with tactics." "It has everything to do with tactics," she hissed, leaning forward. "You rely entirely on brute force. You build giant cities, enforce rigid laws, and stomp through the woods assuming you own the earth, and it makes you incredibly easy to kill out here." Roman's eyes flashed a violent gold in the shadows. "My laws maintain the order of the realm. Without the sanction, shifters devolve into feral animals." "Without the sanction, we are free." The words ripped out of her throat before she could stop them. The raw anger hung heavily in the freezing air, vibrating with years of repressed trauma. Roman leaned closer, the immense heat of his body washed directly over her face. "You call hiding in a frozen shack, terrified of your own shadow, true freedom?" "I call it surviving your tyranny." She spat the words like venom. "I lost my family to your purges. I spent 10 years looking over my shoulder every single day because your council decided my existence was a crime. Do not lecture me about order." Roman didn't bark back. The fierce king of the realm stared blankly at the small, furious woman sitting across from him. His commanding posture softened a fraction. For the first time, he looked at her not as a rogue liability, but as a bleeding casualty of his own broken system. "I Roman started, his deep voice unusually hesitant, stripped of its absolute authority. The apology died instantly in his throat. The hollow base of the redwood went unnaturally still. The wind stopped howling entirely. The faint rhythmic snapping of frozen branches ceased. Sloane's blood turned to ice. She looked out toward the dark, snowy perimeter where the vanguard stood guard. The birds had stopped singing. The ambient noise of the entire forest had vanished into a dead vacuum. She grabbed Roman's forearm, her fingers digging desperately into his hot skin. "They're here!" A high-pitched hiss pierced the dead silence. 3 metallic canisters dropped through the dead pine branches, landing directly in the center of their hidden camp. Shimmering gray smoke erupted from the vents. The metallic tang of weaponized silver hit the back of Sloane's throat. "Don't breathe!" she screamed, throwing her heavy wool scarf over her mouth and nose. The vanguard reacted with terrifying speed. Massive, heavily muscled bodies blurred past her in the dark. But the mercenaries didn't break the tree line. They stayed hidden in the high ridges, cowardly firing a volley of silver-tipped darts into the thick smoke. A warrior to Sloane's left let out a guttural roar, dropping to one knee as a dart pierced his shoulder. Her body moved on instinct. She dropped to the snow, bringing her crossbow up to her eye level. She couldn't see the shooters, but she could see the faint orange muzzle flashes cutting through the blizzard. She pulled the trigger. The heavy bolt vanished into the dark. A distant, wet thud echoed from the ridge, followed by the satisfying crash of a body tumbling through the dead branches. "They are trying to pin us in the smoke!" Sloane barked over the chaos, slamming a fresh bolt into the firing groove. "We have to break the perimeter now!" Roman suddenly materialized through the blinding gray fog, grabbing the injured vanguard warrior by the harness and hauling him to his feet. He looked down at Sloane, his golden eyes burning through the toxic haze. He demanded, "Which way?" She yelled, firing blindly into the trees again to provide cover. "Run!" They broke perfectly from the camp. Sloane took the rear, firing backward into the encroaching shadows while the vanguard tore through the deep snow ahead of her. The cowards in the trees fired blindly, too terrified to engage the pack in hand-to-hand combat. A violent gust of wind slammed into them. A total whiteout condition hit the mountain instantly, blinding both the hunters and the hunted. Sloane sprinted blindly, following the crashing sounds of the vanguard. The ground gave way beneath her boots. She plummeted downward into darkness, sliding violently down a steep embankment. She hit the bottom hard, splashing into a deep pool of subterranean water. The shock of the icy plunge forced the air from her lungs. She scrambled frantically onto the rocky shore of the narrow cave system, gasping for air. The freezing water soaked her clothes straight to the bone. Sloane collapsed against the damp stone wall of the narrow cavern. She couldn't stop shaking. Her teeth chattered so hard her jaw ached. The adrenaline crash hit her system like a boulder, leaving her paralyzed in the freezing dark. Heavy, splashing footsteps echoed around her. The vanguard had made it down into the cave. "We lost them," a rough voice echoed from the shadows. The blizzard covered the tracks. Sloane tried to speak, but her lips were numb. A deep lethargy began pulling her down. She closed her eyes. It would be incredibly easy to just fall asleep right here on the rocks. "She is freezing." Roman's voice cut sharply through the heavy darkness. The narrow cavern filled with the visceral sound of shifting. Bones snapped, muscles tore and reformed. The heavy, musky scent of wet fur overpowered the damp smell of the cave. Heated bodies crowded into the claustrophobic space around her. Thick, coarse fur brushed against her frozen cheek. A giant wolf curled around her legs, blocking out the freezing draft from the cave entrance. Another beast pressed against her back, radiating burning heat directly into her soaked clothes. She opened her eyes slowly. The entire vanguard had shifted. 11 lethal monsters had formed a living, breathing fortress of fur around her tiny, trembling frame. The sheer heat of their bodies was incredible.
Then a massive shadow blocked out the faint, gray light from the cave entrance. Roman had not shifted. He knelt in front of her, his hands reaching out to pull her flush against his broad, scarred chest. He wrapped his thick wool cloak tightly around them both, trapping the immense body heat inside. "Stay awake," he ordered softly, his deep voice rumbling against her ear. The raw intimacy of the moment short-circuited her panicked brain. These were apex predators, the elite killers of the realm, and they were actively keeping her heart beating. As the shaking began to subside, the profound realization hit her. The pack was not a threat anymore. They were safety. Her vision slowly cleared in the dim light. She looked up, finding Roman already looking down at her, his golden eyes locked onto hers with a dangerous, heavy intensity. The storm raged outside, but the inside of the cavern was entirely quiet, save for the deep, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping wolves. Sloane remained perfectly still against Roman's chest. The overwhelming heat had finally thawed her limbs, but she did not pull away. The electric tension between them had shifted into something far more complicated. "You fought for them," Roman finally spoke, his voice a gravelly whisper in the dark. "I covered the retreat," she corrected quietly, looking down at his scarred hands. "You didn't run." He shifted slightly, looking down at her. "You had a clear path into the trees. You could have vanished. But you stayed in the silver smoke and fought for my men. They were trapped." As the silence stretched, Roman let out a long exhale. He leaned his head back against the jagged stone wall. The fierce, rigid Alpha King looked hollowed out in the dim light. "The purges," he started, the words sounding heavy on his tongue. He stopped, taking a painful breath. "I did not write the exile laws, Sloane." She froze. "When I took the throne, the realm was starving. The outer territories were chaotic. The ruling council offered massive grain shipments to stabilize the cities, but they demanded a brutal consolidation of power in return." Sloane stared at him, her mind struggling to process the information. "You signed the orders?" "They forced the edicts through while I was fighting the northern border wars," Roman whispered, his jaw clenching tight. "I returned to a locked, heavily militarized capital. The council controls the silver trade. They control the food. I am a king, locked inside a gilded cage, enforcing laws I despise just to keep my people from starving to death." The tension broke. Her worldview shattered instantly. The monster she had spent 10 years hiding from wasn't a tyrant at all. He was a hostage. They were both victims of the exact same corrupt machine. "That is why they are hunting you," she realized slowly, the pieces finally clicking together. "You are trying to break their hold." Roman nodded slowly. "And now they will simply replace me with a puppet."
Sloane looked down at the sleeping wolves surrounding them. She looked back up at the broken king holding her close. She took a slow, deep breath, making the single most terrifying decision of her life. There is a human frontier town 10 miles south of this ridge. I have a hidden contact there, an underground smuggler. He owes me his life. He can get us secure transport back to your capital. Roman searched her face in the dark. You would risk your last safe haven for us? We are going to take your throne back, she whispered. The iron gates of the frontier town groaned loudly against the howling wind. Sloane pulled the thick, damp wool of her hood far over her face. She stepped directly into the deep mud of the main thoroughfare. The overwhelming stench of the settlement hit her instantly. It was a suffocating wall of unwashed bodies, sour ale spilling into the frozen gutters, and the unmistakable metallic tang of hidden weapons. She kept her head down, navigating the chaotic maze of the black market with practiced efficiency. Behind her, the disguised pack moved like a single shadow. The 11 vanguard warriors wore heavy, drab cloaks that concealed their towering frames, but they still drew dangerous, lingering stares from the cutthroats lining the alleys. They were simply too big. They moved with a synchronized grace that human mercenaries could never replicate. Roman walked entirely too close to her right shoulder. His heat radiated right through his soaked cloak, a constant reminder of the impossible risk she was taking. Keep your eyes strictly on the mud, Sloane whispered harshly over her shoulder, not breaking her rapid stride. If anyone bumps into you, do not react. They are looking for an excuse to draw steel. They reek of fear, Roman rumbled back, his deep voice barely audible over the shouting of the street vendors. They reek of desperation, which makes them incredibly dangerous. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every shadowed doorway felt like a trap. Every loud crash from the taverns made her flinch. She was exposed in a human town with the most wanted man in the realm walking directly behind her. If a council spy recognized that jawline, they would never make it out of the valley alive. They turned down a narrow alleyway choked with rotting wooden crates. Sloane stopped in front of a heavy iron door, stripped of any markings. She knocked a precise, rhythmic pattern against the rusted metal. 3 rapid strikes, a pause, 2 heavy thuds. The iron deadbolt slid back with a grating screech. A tall, thin man with a heavily scarred cheek peered out into the freezing alley. His sharp eyes darted quickly from Sloane's pale face to the towering, hooded figures standing entirely too still behind her. You bring a literal army to my doorstep, Sloane? The smuggler hissed, his hand resting heavily on the loaded pistol at his hip. I brought silver, she lied smoothly, her voice flat and devoid of the terror clawing at her throat. And I need the cellar. As the silence stretched, the smuggler weighed the risk. He stepped back into the shadows, pulling the heavy door open. They filed rapidly into the dark, stifling warmth of the safe house. Sloane slammed the iron door shut behind them, throwing the heavy deadbolt firmly into place. The sudden quiet of the locked building was deafening. She had done it. They were off the streets. The cramped upper room of the safe house smelled of dried sage and old dust. Downstairs, the vanguard was finally resting on the cellar floor, hidden completely from the street. Up here, the air was dangerously thin. The tiny room possessed only a single cot and a battered wooden desk. The ceiling was so low that Roman had to duck his head simply to stand near the frosted window pane. The electric tension between them finally snapped. "We leave at midnight," Roman ordered, turning away from the glass. His voice was a harsh, commanding rumble that filled the tiny space entirely. "We hijack a supply carriage and ride straight through the southern checkpoint." "No!" Sloane fired back instantly. She dropped her wet coat onto the floorboards. "The southern gate is heavily guarded by council hounds. We use the river barges. We wait for my contact to forge the transit papers." Roman crossed the tiny room in 2 massive strides. He stopped mere inches from her face, his broad chest rising and falling heavily. "I am not putting the survival of my pack in the hands of a human criminal." "You are putting it in my hands," she yelled, her voice breaking slightly. "I know how the underground works. You have absolutely no idea how to hide." "I do not hide." "Then you will die." The fiery argument dissolved instantly into a heavy, suffocating silence. Roman stared down at her. The rigid lines of his face unraveled. He looked at her trembling hands. He looked at her pale, exhausted face. He lifted his massive hands slowly, carefully framing her jaw. His thumbs brushed gently over her freezing skin. The desperate anger melted completely into raw, undeniable gravity. "You are risking everything," he whispered, his golden eyes locked onto hers. "I know," she breathed. Roman leaned down. He didn't take command. He didn't force her. He hesitated, his lips hovering a mere fraction of an inch above hers, silently asking for her permission. Sloane closed the distance herself. The kiss was desperate. It tasted of rain, copper, and profound relief. Roman wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her effortlessly off the floorboards, burying his face directly into her neck. Her hands tangled into his dark, damp hair. The crushing weight of her lifelong isolation vanished, replaced by the terrifying reality of being tethered to another living soul. He yielded his authority to her. The fierce Alpha King let her dictate the pace, letting her pull him down onto the narrow, creaking cot. Hours later, the small room was dark. Roman was asleep, his arm draped securely across her waist, his deep breathing incredibly steady in the quiet room. Sloane slipped carefully out from under his weight, her bare feet silent against the wooden floorboards. She walked over to the battered desk to retrieve her discarded dagger. Her hand stopped midair. Resting perfectly flat on the scarred wood, partially hidden beneath a stack of blank transit papers, was a heavy coin. Sloane picked it up. Her blood turned to ice. It was solid silver. Stamped perfectly in the center was the unmistakable crest of the High Ruling Council. Sloane could not breathe. She turned the silver coin over in her trembling palm. It was brand new, polished. It was the exact currency the council used to pay their elite mercenary trackers. Her confidant, the only human she had trusted with her life for 5 years. He hadn't just given them the cellar out of old loyalty. He had recognized Roman. He had sold them out. The agonizing heartbreak hit her first. A suffocating ache crushed her chest, her deepest, most paralyzing fear that trusting anyone always led directly to death was suddenly validated. Then she smelled it. Faint at first, but incredibly distinct. The sharp, electric aroma of ozone leaking directly through the gaps in the floorboards. The exact same smell she had encountered in the snowy forest. Weaponized silver powder. Panic flooded her system. How long had they been sleeping? How many mercenaries were outside? Were they already in the cellar with the vanguard? A boot scuffed loudly against the wooden stairs right outside the bedroom door. Her body moved on instinct. She threw herself across the tiny room, tackling Roman directly off the narrow cot. "Get up!" she screamed, her voice raw with terror. "Wake up!" Roman hit the floorboards hard. His golden eyes snapped open with terrifying, immediate predatory focus. He didn't ask questions. He felt the pure panic radiating off her skin and smelled the deadly ozone in the air. He surged to his feet, grabbing his iron broadsword from the corner. "They are in the house," Sloane gasped, grabbing her crossbow from the floor. Her hands shook so violently she could barely load the bolt. "He sold us out. He tracked us." She didn't finish the sentence. The heavy wooden door of the bedroom exploded. A concussive blast of fire and splattered silver tore the door off its iron hinges. The heavy wood slammed violently into the far wall, showering the tiny room with burning splinters and thick, blinding gray smoke. Roman threw his massive body over hers, shielding her from the deadly shrapnel as the blast wave rocked the floorboards. Through the burning haze, heavily armored mercenaries poured into the narrow doorway, raising heavy silver casters directly at the king's chest. The concussive ringing in Sloane's ears was absolute. Thick, burning gray smoke choked the tiny upper room. The smell of scorched wood and weaponized ozone was suffocating. Roman roared, a guttural sound that rattled the remaining floorboards. He swung his iron broadsword in a devastating arc. The blade cleaved directly through the heavy armor of the first mercenary through the door. Dark blood sprayed across the plaster walls. Sloane rolled out from under Roman's arm, ignoring the burning splinters embedded in her coat. She brought her heavy crossbow up, the wood slick with sweat. She pulled the trigger. The heavy bolt caught the second armored elite directly in the throat. He collapsed heavily, choking on his own blood. "The stairs!" she screamed over the chaos. They tore through the shattered doorway, plunging into the narrow, smoke-filled stairwell. The lower floor of the safe house was engulfed in horrific violence. The vanguard had shifted, but the cramped cellar neutralized their tactical advantage. Heavily armored council elites were pouring through the shattered windows, filling the tavern with blinding, highly concentrated silver gas. The massive wolves fought viciously, their jaws snapping through armor, but they were taking casualties from the toxic smoke. Through the burning gray haze, Sloane saw him, the smuggler, her contact. He stood behind a wall of armored shields near the ruined front door. He didn't look malicious. He looked absolutely terrified, clutching a leather purse of silver coins tightly against his chest. Her paralyzing heartbreak transmuted into pure, lethal rage. She dropped the empty crossbow entirely. She drew her curved hunting dagger and vaulted over the splintered banister. She landed fiercely on the back of a mercenary, driving the sharp blade deep into the vulnerable gap in his heavy iron collar. She fought viciously, a feral blur of movement. She ducked under a heavy sword swing, slashing the tendons of another elite's knee. She was carving a bloody path for Roman's massive strikes. They were pushing the line back. They were going to break through the front door. Then a heavily armored captain stepped directly through the shattered front wall. He didn't carry a caster. He carried a heavy, pressurized shoulder cannon. He aimed the wide, dark barrel directly at Roman's massive chest and pulled the trigger. A heavy iron net, dripping entirely with glowing viscous liquid silver, shot across the ruined tavern. "Sloane!" Roman slammed his shoulder directly into her chest. The shove threw her completely backwards. She crashed heavily through the splintered remains of a wooden table, the air violently leaving her lungs. The heavy iron net struck Roman squarely in the chest. The glowing liquid silver hissed violently against his hot skin. A guttural roar of blinding agony ripped out of his throat. The heavy iron weights wrapped tightly around his massive limbs, dropping him instantly to the ruined floorboards. The silver burned straight through his clothes, sinking viciously into his muscle and binding his immense strength. "No!" Sloane screamed, scrambling frantically over the broken glass and debris. "Hold the perimeter!" the mercenary captain barked. More council elites flooded the tavern, firing relentless volleys of silver darts directly into the struggling vanguard. The massive wolves were pinned down, howling in raw pain as the heavy poison overwhelmed their massive systems. 4 heavy mercenaries grabbed the thick chains attached to the silver net. They dragged Roman's massive, incapacitated body violently across the broken floorboards, hauling him out into the freezing mud of the frontier street. Sloane lunged for the doorway, her dagger raised. A heavy armored boot slammed directly into her ribs. She collapsed, her vision flashing completely white with pain. Through the ruined doorway, she watched helplessly. The mercenaries hauled Roman up into the reinforced steel holding cell of a massive, heavily armored transport carriage. Roman lifted his heavy head one last time. His glowing golden eyes found hers through the smoke in the falling snow. He didn't look terrified. He didn't look defeated. He looked directly at her with a heavy, desperate, silent command. Stay down. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a deafening final clang. The massive transport engine roared to life, crushing the freezing mud beneath its heavy iron treads as it accelerated rapidly out of the town. The remaining mercenaries threw 3 more silver gas canisters into the burning tavern and fell back into the deep night. The smoke cleared agonizingly slowly. The freezing winter wind howled violently through the massive holes in the walls. Sloane was left kneeling in the snow-filled rubble, her hands entirely empty. She was entirely alone once more. The silence in the ruined safe house was completely suffocating. Sloane sat completely still on the frozen, splintered floorboards. The bitter winter wind ripped through the shattered walls, dusting her pale, numb face with fresh snow. Dark, heavy blood, Roman's blood, stained her hands, a terrifying contrast against her pale, freezing skin. Around her, the agonizing groans of the surviving vanguard echoed in the dark. Only 5 of the massive wolves remained conscious. They were bleeding heavily, dragging their massive bodies across the floorboards, pulling poisoned silver darts from their thick hides with their own teeth. Her breathing was incredibly shallow, erratic. She looked out the shattered doorway, staring into the dark, empty street where the massive transport had vanished. It would be so incredibly easy. She could stand up right now. She could walk away from this ruined building, slip back into the deep, dark tree line, and vanish entirely. She could rebuild her hidden cabin. She could go back to the isolation that had kept her alive for 10 long, lonely years. No pacts, no wars, no crushing betrayals. She had her freedom. It was waiting for her right there in the snow. But she looked down at her bloody hands again. The crushing memory of Roman's immense heat enveloped her freezing skin, the raw, desperate way he had yielded his authority to her in the cramped upper room. The undeniable truth that the fierce Alpha King had just sacrificed his own freedom, his own life, to save hers from the blast. She closed her eyes. The paralyzing fear that had controlled her entire existence began to fracture. It cracked, it splintered, it shattered completely. She wasn't a scared, feral outcast hiding in the shadows anymore. She had walked straight through the deadly whiteout. She had fought the elite council mercenaries. She had claimed the Alpha King of the realm, and he had claimed her back. The icy terror in her chest melted away, replaced entirely by a pure, cold, sociopathic steel. Sloane took a slow, deep, grounding breath. She stood up, her heavy boots crunched loudly over the broken glass. She walked purposefully to the center of the ruined tavern and reached down, wrapping her bloody fingers tightly around the heavy hilt of a fallen mercenary's silver blade. The 5 massive vanguard wolves stopped pulling their darts. They looked up at the tiny, fierce woman standing in the snow, their glowing golden eyes reflecting the dim moonlight. Sloane stared down the dark, muddy tracks left by the heavy transport. "We hunt." The jagged map was carved in the frozen mud of the ruined tavern floor with the tip of a stolen silver blade. Sloane knelt over the crude lines, the bitter winter wind whipping her hair fiercely across her pale cheeks. The 5 remaining vanguard warriors surrounded her. They were battered, their massive chests rising and falling in shallow, painful gasps, but their glowing golden eyes were fixed entirely on the bloody steel in her hand. "The transport is heavy," Sloane stated, her voice a cold, flat void, devoid of any remaining panic. "It is fully armored, carrying a massive payload of mercenaries. They will not take the deep forest trails. They have to stick to the main trade roads to avoid sinking into the powder." She dragged the tip of the dagger through the dirt, drawing a narrow bottleneck between 2 steep ridges. "Black Ridge Pass," she said, tapping the blade against the cold earth. "It is a sheer drop on both sides. The road narrows to less than 20 feet wide. They have to slow the engine to a crawl to navigate the ice, or the entire carriage will slide off the cliff." The largest of the surviving wolves let out a low, questioning rumble. "You do not engage the armored guards," she commanded sharply, looking directly into the massive beast's eyes. "You are too severely injured. You wait in the snowdrifts until the carriage enters the narrowest part of the pass. Then, you attack the iron treads. You rip the gears apart. You stall the engine completely." She stood up, wiping the freezing mud from her knees. She grabbed a heavy coil of climbing rope and a stolen belt of silver powder explosives from a dead mercenary's chest. "I will take the roof," she finished softly. The vanguard warriors didn't hesitate. They didn't challenge her authority. They lowered their massive heads in silent, absolute agreement, accepting this suicidal tactical plan without question. They left the burning ruins of the safe house behind, moving rapidly through the dark, freezing woods. Sloane ran with a cold, sociopathic focus. Her muscles burned. Her ribs ached violently from the heavy boots she took to the chest. But her mind was completely empty of everything except the heavy, musky scent of Roman's blood lingering in the freezing air. She was a ghost in the trees. She was commanding the very forces she had spent her entire life fleeing. They reached the high cliffs of Black Ridge Pass just as the sky began to turn a bruised, bleeding purple. Sloane crept entirely to the sheer edge, lying flat against the freezing stone. Below her, the narrow, icy road curved dangerously between the massive drops. As the silence stretched, a deep, unnatural vibration began to shake the stone beneath her. The distant, heavy rumble of a massive engine echoed fiercely through the mountain pass. The wind shear screaming past the jagged cliff face was deafening. Sloane gripped the freezing edge of the stone, her eyes locked onto the massive, heavily armored transport slowly grinding its way around the icy bend directly beneath her. It was a terrifying iron beast. Thick black smoke poured continuously from its exhaust vents, choking the narrow gorge with the bitter, heavy stench of burning grease and crushed coal. "Wait," she whispered to herself, tracking the exact speed of the heavy iron roof. "Wait." The heavy carriage crawled directly beneath her ledge. Sloane pushed off the stone and dropped into the freezing void. She plummeted through the icy air, The heavy iron roof rushed up to meet her. She hit the metal hard, rolling violently to absorb the brutal impact. The jarring force rattled her teeth and sent a sharp, terrifying spike of pain through her bruised ribs. But she didn't stop moving. Two heavily armored mercenaries standing guard on the rear deck immediately turned at the heavy thump. Sloane was already on her feet. She ducked completely under the first guard's heavy swinging rifle, driving her stolen silver blade straight up through the weak point under his jaw. He collapsed instantly, sliding off the icy roof into the deep gorge. The second guard raised his weapon. Below the transport, a guttural, terrifying howl erupted from the snowdrifts. The vanguard struck. Massive, bloodied wolves slammed violently into the heavy iron treads of the carriage. The deafening sound of thick metal tearing and heavy gears violently snapping filled the gorge. The transport violently lurched sideways. The heavy brakes shrieked in protest, throwing sparks everywhere. The overwhelming smell of burning iron and scorched brake pads instantly filled the freezing air. The sudden stop threw the second guard completely off balance. Sloane didn't hesitate. She closed the distance in a single, fluid strike, kicking his legs entirely out from under him and driving the heavy hilt of her dagger directly into his temple. She stood alone on the smoking roof. She holstered her blade and pulled the stolen silver powder explosive from her belt. She jammed the charge directly into the heavy iron locking mechanism of the main roof hatch. She twisted the short fuse, hearing the sharp, chemical hiss of the primer. She sprinted backward, diving flat against the freezing metal. The heavy hatch blew completely off its hinges with a deafening crack. Thick gray smoke poured fiercely out of the massive hole in the roof. Sloane pulled her second stolen dagger, took a sharp, frantic breath of the freezing mountain air, and dropped entirely into the dark belly of the beast. The inside of the holding cell was a claustrophobic nightmare. The heavy air was completely saturated with the vile, metallic tang of raw silver and the sharp scent of burnt ozone. Dim, blood-red emergency lights flickered violently on the reinforced steel walls. Sloane hit the metal floorboards in a tight crouch. Through the thick, toxic smoke, she saw him. Roman was forced onto his knees in the absolute center of the cell. Heavy, glowing silver chains were wrapped tightly around his massive chest and thick arms. The poison was actively burning his flesh, hissing violently against his hot skin. His head hung heavily forward, his dark hair plastered with sweat and dark blood. "You actually came back for him?" A harsh, cruel voice echoed from the shadows. Sloane whipped her head up. The heavy mercenary captain stood completely in the corner of the cell. He raised the massive, pressurized silver caster directly at Roman's chest. The weapon whined violently, the heavy internal coils spinning up to fire a devastating, point-blank blast of pure liquid silver. Roman raised his massive head. His golden eyes locked onto Sloane. "Run!" he choked out, his voice completely wrecked by the burning poison. The caster reached a high, screaming pitch. The captain's finger tightened entirely on the heavy trigger. Sloane didn't run. The girl who had spent 10 years running from every shadow, the feral rogue who only ever survived by saving herself, didn't even hesitate. She threw her entire body violently through the air, diving directly between the heavy barrel of the caster and the chained king. The deafening blast shook the entire carriage. A searing, blinding agony ripped completely across Sloane's left shoulder. The graving hit of the liquid silver burned straight through her thick coat, melting directly into her skin like white-hot acid.
The sheer force of the blast threw her brutally against the reinforced steel wall. She collapsed onto the metal floorboards, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming pain. Her vision instantly blurred dark. The air rushed entirely out of her lungs, but she forced her heavy eyes to stay open. She looked desperately across the smoking floor at Roman. He was completely untouched by the blast. Roman looked at Sloane's bleeding, broken body lying on the floor. The agonizing pain on his face vanished instantly. It was completely replaced by a pure, terrifying, godlike fury. The fierce Alpha King threw his massive head back. An earth-shattering, impossible war of absolute, unhinged rage tore through the steel cell. The thick, glowing silver chains wrapped around his massive chest suddenly groaned, and then violently snapped into 100 broken pieces. The deafening sound of shattering iron echoed completely through the narrow cell. Sloane lay completely paralyzed on the freezing metal floorboards, gasping for air. The searing, blinding pain from the silver burn on her shoulder radiated down to her very fingertips, making her vision swim in violent, dark waves. But she forced her heavy eyes to stay open. She could not look away. Roman was no longer a captive. He was a force of absolute, untethered nature. The heavy mercenary captain desperately, frantically tried to prime the pressurized silver caster again. His hands shook violently. He didn't even get the chance to pull the heavy trigger. Roman closed the massive distance between them in a single, terrifying blur of motion. He didn't use a blade. He didn't use a caster. The fierce Alpha King grabbed the heavy armored chest plates of the captain with both of his massive bare hands. With a guttural, terrifying roar, Roman lifted the massive mercenary completely off the metal floorboards and hurled him violently across the cell. The captain struck the reinforced steel wall with a sickening, bone-crushing crack. He crumpled entirely to the floor, motionless. Between one breath and the next, the remaining council elites panicked completely. They dropped their heavy weapons, scrambling frantically for the smoking roof hatch. They didn't make it. Roman tore through the heavily armored guards with brutal, terrifying efficiency. He moved with the lethal synchronized grace of a massive apex predator, dismantling the cowardly hunters who had relied entirely on poison and distance. The heavy air of the cell filled completely with the horrifying sounds of shattering armor and desperate, cut-off screams. Sloane watched him through the thick, burning haze. Her pulse fluttered weakly against her throat. She was bleeding heavily, her strength completely fading into the dark. But a profound, overwhelming sense of awe washed over her freezing skin. She was witnessing the true, unfiltered power of the absolute king of the realm. The terrifying monster she had spent a decade running from was tearing the world apart simply because someone had hurt her. He was fighting for her. The heavy transport fell completely, unnervingly silent. The last mercenary dropped heavily to the steel floor. Roman stood, completely still, in the center of the carnage. His massive chest heaved violently. His knuckles were stained entirely dark with blood. The fierce, golden light in his eyes burned with an unhinged, predatory fury. Then, he heard Sloane let out a faint, ragged gasp. The terrifying monster vanished instantly. Roman dropped to his knees, his massive frame sliding violently across the slick metal floorboards. He reached her side, his large, blood-stained hands frantically framing her pale, freezing face. Sloane, he choked out, his deep voice completely wrecked with absolute terror. "Look at me. Keep your eyes on me."
"It burns," she whispered, her voice completely fragile and broken. "I know," Roman rumbled frantically. He ripped his heavy, ruined cloak from his broad shoulders, pressing the thick wool firmly against the terrible, smoking wound on her collarbone. "I have you. I have you completely." The freezing winter wind howled violently through the massive hole in the roof, carrying the heavy scent of pine and fresh snow into the toxic cell. Sloane felt entirely disconnected from her own limbs. The agonizing burn of the silver was slowly giving way to a deep, heavy numbness. The dark edges of her vision crept closer, threatening to pull her under entirely. Roman shifted his massive weight. He didn't look for bandages. He didn't look for a medic. He raised his massive right wrist directly to his own mouth. He bit down violently, tearing his own flesh with his sharp canines. "Drink," he ordered softly, pressing his bleeding wrist firmly against her pale lips. The heavy, metallic tang of alpha blood hit her tongue instantly. It wasn't cold. It was incredibly, unbelievably hot. The moment she swallowed, a fierce, burning rush of pure energy flooded directly into her chest. The crushing, heavy numbness began to aggressively recede, chased away by the overwhelming ancient magic racing completely through her veins. Her heavy eyelids fluttered, the searing pain in her shoulder dialed back to a dull, manageable ache. Heavy, massive boots landed completely on the ruined metal roof above them.
The 5 remaining vanguard warriors dropped silently through the shattered hatch, landing in a wide, protective circle around Roman and Sloane. They were heavily battered, completely covered in freezing mud and dark blood, but they stood completely tall. The threat was entirely neutralized. Roman did not let go of Sloane. He gathered her completely into his massive arms, lifting her trembling body flush against his broad, warm chest. He looked up at the towering warriors. "Hear my word." Roman's deep voice resonated powerfully through the ruined carriage, utterly stripping away the frantic terror from moments before. The absolute authority of the king returned, heavy and undeniable. "The council is broken. Their mercenaries are dead. The purges end tonight." The vanguard remained perfectly still, listening to the absolute law of the realm being rewritten in the dark. "The exile edicts are completely repealed," Roman continued, his golden eyes blazing fiercely. He looked down at Sloane, his massive hand gently tracing her pale jaw. "Sloane is granted a full, absolute royal pardon. She answers to absolutely no one. She is under my direct, eternal protection." Sloane let out a slow, trembling breath. The crushing heavy weight of 10 years of pure paranoia completely vanished from her chest. Her external war was over. Her internal terror was gone. She buried her face deeply into Roman's warm neck, finally allowing the profound, alien sense of absolute safety to completely wash over her. Roman stood up slowly, carrying her effortlessly against his massive chest. He stepped directly over the broken iron chains and carried her out into the freezing mountain air, not as a terrified prisoner, but as an absolute sovereign. The heavy, polished marble floors of the high court gleamed flawlessly under the massive crystal chandeliers. Sloane stood completely still in the center of the vast, echoing hall. She wore a heavy, sweeping gown of dark, midnight silk, completely stripped of the heavy wool coats and freezing mud that had defined her entire existence.
The intricate, heavy silver scars on her left shoulder were entirely visible, a profound mark of absolute survival rather than a brand of shame. The air in the capital was warm, heavily scented with burning cedar and fresh winter roses. The massive wooden doors at the end of the long hall swung completely open. Roman walked down the long velvet runner. He was dressed in the heavy, formal black leathers of the High Alpha King, but he completely ignored the hundreds of aristocratic lords and ladies lining the grand walls. His golden eyes locked entirely onto Sloane. He closed the massive distance between them. He reached out, weaving his large, warm fingers perfectly through hers. "Are you ready?" he murmured, his deep voice a private, rumbling secret meant strictly for her ears. "I am," she whispered back, completely steady. They turned entirely in unison, facing the massive, silent crowd. Below the high dais, the elite vanguard stepped forward. The towering, lethal warriors moved in perfect, synchronized rhythm. They didn't look at the whispering nobles. They looked directly at the small, fierce woman standing perfectly equal beside their massive king. The giant warrior with the heavily scarred jaw dropped completely to one knee. Behind him, the entire elite pack followed, bowing their massive heads in total, absolute reverence to the fiercely independent queen who had bled for them in the snow. Sloane looked out over the kneeling monsters and the completely silent court. The deeply ingrained instinct to run, the desperate urge to hide in the shadows, was entirely gone. She gripped Roman's massive hand tighter. The warmth radiating from his skin completely anchored her to the beautiful, permanent reality of her new life. She was no longer a lone wolf. She had found her absolute forever pack. The heavy, silent awe of the massive room settled completely. As Sloane smiled, the final, fading sound was not the howling wind of a bitter winter, but the slow, deep, perfectly synchronized rhythm of the queen and her king's beating hearts. Thump, 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 thump.